Today I wanted to talk about sourdough. Have you wanted to start sourdough bread, making sourdough bread, and you get on the Facebook forums and read all the comments, and it just seems like super intimidating? Me too. So I didn't start making sourdough bread until probably September. So I'm fairly new to this too. I'm still trying to figure it out for our house and what we like, but I think I have some tips for you today. Hi, I'm Dana. I'm the Overwhelmed Mama, and I spent years being overwhelmed by my kids and by my house, and I just wasn't enjoying life, which sounds very dramatic, but it's true. I've changed several things, and I'm here to help you love your life, love being a mom, love the service that you provide for your family. So, back to sourdough. My husband got a sourdough starter from my mom for Christmas one year, and it just sat in the cupboard. Actually, it didn't just sit in the cupboard. He loves to bake. My husband loves to bake. But working 10-hour days and being involved in church, it just doesn't really lend to baking as much for our family. So I'm like, hey, I'm going to use this. I'd been hearing for years the benefits of sourdough and what it can do for you. I also grew up just outside of Seattle and grew up loving sourdough bread. So I wanted to figure out how to make that at home. So these are the things that I have done to make it less overwhelming for me. And so I have broken all the rules and it still works. So first off, I keep my sourdough starter in the fridge. I leave it in there at the back of the fridge until I'm ready to use it. When I'm ready to bake bread that day, I pull it out and I measure it out cold. I don't feed it beforehand. I just measure out my 100 grams into my bowl and add in I think it's 325 grams. Don't quote me on it. Check my recipe in the description. Anyways, I add in my water and my salt and I mix it together until it's dissolved in my bowl. And then I measure out my flour, which I think. And recently I decided to start milling our own wheat because I had heard all the benefits of it if you would like to. So recently I decided to mill all of our own flour, and that has been amazing. There was another very overwhelming thing to me, but the benefits outweighed hesitation, I guess, to do it. And so I started doing it. And if you'd like to learn the benefits, I wrote a blog post about that and how to transition as a family to freshly milled flour. I wrote a blog post about that on my blog. If you want to check that out, I'll have that linked down in the description. But what was I saying? Oh, back to sourdough. So, squirrel. Sorry. So then I add my freshly milled flour and I mix that until it's like a shaggy dough. And with fresh milled flour, it does not absorb liquid the same way that store commercially found flour does. And so you have to let it rest for at least 15 minutes to absorb the liquid and for the flour to be hydrated. And so I mix it up and that's going to sit on my counter for a little bit. It's usually about an hour that I leave it. I go and do something else. I go do a homeschool lesson. I put a little laundry in. Anyways, and I leave it. I put a damp towel on top and just let it do its thing. I don't babysit it at all. And so after that, I have found that if I try and do stretch and folds, I forget. And so I'll get one in and then I'll forget about it and then it's a little too late. And so I have found for me personally, sticking it on the KitchenAid with my dough hook and letting it knead until it gets to a window pane consistency, which is where you can take the dough and stretch it gently and you can see light through it. And that with fresh milled flour, it takes maybe 15, 20, 25 minutes. It just depends on the conditions in your house and how long you let the flour sit and absorb the liquid. And then after that, I oil up a bowl. I have these stainless steel bowls that I love. I use them for everything. They have lids and they work great. So I oil up one of those and I put the dough ball and I swirl it around in the oil and I put the lid on and I let it sit on my counter for 8 to 12 hours. Usually I do this stage. So usually I'm mixing up my dough right before I go to bed. Not right before, but right around dinner time. And then I let it sit through dinner time and bedtime. And then I'll come back and I'll knead the dough and then I'll let it sit on the counter overnight as I sleep. And then, so in the morning, if you choose to do it that way, or 8 hours later, I take out the dough ball. Usually it's risen quite a bit. It'll be, what's the consistency? Cloudy almost. Like, anyways, I will put in a video to show you what to really look for when your dough has bulk fermented. That's what this, leaving it out on the counter, that's what it's called, bulk fermenting. You're letting the sourdough kind of ferment with that new flour, and that's what gives you the rise. Anyways, so I plop out the dough ball onto my counter and I shape it. And usually how I shape my, people have some very fancy ways of shaping their dough, but really what you're doing when you're shaping the dough is creating tension on top of your loaf. And did you want to come join me? Goose wanted to come join me. Anyways, so when you're shaping, you're creating tension on top of your loaf. And so you want to, I usually stretch mine out into a rectangular shape and then I roll it in on itself kind of tightly. And then I use my hands to push around the back away from myself and pull it towards me, if that makes sense. And so it's creating this tension on top of that loaf. And then I choose to proof my dough in bannetons. You don't have to have fancy bannetons, not that they're fancy, but you can just proof it in a loaf pan. You can proof it on parchment paper. It really doesn't matter. I find the way that I do it in bannetons is easier because once I shape it, so when you put it in your banneton, you want the pretty side to be down in the banneton and you want the seam side to be up. Because when you go to flip your banneton out, when you go to bake it, then that will make the top side up. Anyways, so the way I do it, I learned this from Lisa at a farmhouse on Boone, and that's where all my base recipes are from too, so check out her blog, it's fantastic. Yeah, so she puts her dough in to be proofed in the bannetons. She will take a plastic shopping bag and put her banneton in it and then tie a knot in the plastic bag and stick it in the fridge until she is ready to bake it. And so that is what I do as well. And then when we need bread, I just pull it out. And then, so I preheat, I have a Dutch oven. I stick my Dutch oven in my oven. And then I preheat my oven to 550 degrees or however high your oven goes. It varies based on brand and stuff like that. But I will preheat, and that takes 45 minutes to an hour for my oven to preheat. So that's preheating my Dutch oven. As that is preheating, I get out a piece of parchment paper and I take my dough out of the fridge. And you're snoring, dude. I take my dough out of the fridge and I turn it out onto the parchment paper, and then we have a lame, which is basically just, it looks like a wand that you put a safety razor in. You could just use a razor blade or a very sharp knife. And you want to cut at least one big score on your bread so that your bread can expand without, and that kind of, you control where your bread expands from instead of busting out in other places. And then you can make fancy scoring marks if you want to, draw flowers and trees and all the fun things if you want to, if that's your thing. I usually just do little tick marks, I guess. And then once my oven is preheated, I take my Dutch oven out and I take off the lid. And then I put my parchment paper with the dough on it in very carefully because the Dutch oven is very hot. You want to put it in your Dutch oven, and then I take 3 to 4 ice cubes and put them down in between the parchment paper and the Dutch oven. So it's not gonna make my bread soggy. It's down in there. And the reason I do that is to create steam within the Dutch oven. And that helps to delays the crust forming. So it's supposed to make your bread, your oven spring is what people call it, a little bit more. And so I do that, and then I put the lid back on after I've put the ice cubes in, and I put it back in my oven, and I turn the oven down to 475 degrees when I do that, and I set the timer for 20 minutes, yes. And then after the 20 minutes is done, I take off the lid, but I leave the Dutch oven in the oven, and I cook the bread for 20 more minutes. After that 20 minutes, I temp the bread, and I want it to be 190 degrees when I take it out. And then if it's at that point, I take it out and enjoy our lovely bread. So I hope this helps you not feel so overwhelmed and intimidated by sourdough, because it really is not as hard as people make it. People make it very complicated. Oh, and taking care of my sourdough starter. So once I take it out and I take out the sourdough starter that I want to use for my bread, I put in just some flour and water and mix it up. I kind of like it in the the stiffer pancake batter consistency. That's where I keep it, but really I don't measure. And then I leave it out on the counter. Usually I leave it out on the counter until I put the bread back. I put the bread dough in once I've shaped it, if that makes sense. So it's probably about 8 to 12 hours out on the counter, and that lets it be warm and happy. And then I leave it in there again, and the cycle starts all over again. Some weeks I use it multiple times a week. Sometimes I go several weeks without using it because we're not eating a whole lot of bread. But that's how I'm using my sourdough starter right now. Or that's how I make bread with my sourdough starter. So I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Bye.